On the morning of October the 3rd, 1883, a man named Dowell Crane pressed a single silver dollar into his sister-in-law's palm and told her the claim was sold. He said it the way a man reads a verdict he did not write. Flat. Final. Already moving on before the words had settled. He would not meet her eyes. He and his wife were already packed. Their belongings were loaded onto two horses they had bought with the sale money, good horses, the kind a man buys when he has just come into funds he did not earn through his own suffering. They had been thorough. They had been efficient. They had been in their way almost kind about it. Almost. Dowell said there was nothing left. He said the claim was gone. He said Vera should head east, back toward civilization, back toward family, back toward the kind of life a woman without land or money or a husband was supposed to accept without argument. He said all of this while looking somewhere past her left shoulder at the horizon, at the horses, at anything that was not her face. The settlement of Coldwater Flats watched the whole thing. There were perhaps a dozen people standing near enough to see men, mostly a few women near the entrance to Foss Mercantile, a pair of boys sitting on a fence rail who had stopped their kicking and gone still. These were people who had seen hard things before. Frontier life did not shelter a person from hard things. But there was something about this particular morning that made them stop what they were doing and pay attention. They were waiting for Vera Crane to cry, or to argue, or to reach out and grab Dowell's arm and say something desperate. That was what the situation called for. That was the natural shape of a moment like this one. A young widow with nothing, a man on horseback about to ride away a crowd of witnesses who had already written the story in their heads before it finished happening. Vera gave them none of it. Gave. She closed her fingers around the coin. She felt the cold metal press into the lines of her palm. She looked at Dowell Crane for a long moment, and whatever she was feeling in that moment, she kept it in a place he could not see. Then she nodded once. It was a small nod. The kind of nod that does not mean agreement. The kind that means I have heard you, and I am finished with you, and you may go now. Dowell turned away. He mounted his horse without looking back, and his wife followed, and together they rode east along the main track out of Coldwater Flats, their dust rising slowly in the October air, thinning, disappearing. The crowd watched Vera. They expected her to turn to them, to the church, to the mercy of strangers, to the dubious comfort of community pity, which is a real thing and sometimes sustains people but always costs something in the receiving of it. Instead, Vera Crane turned her back on Coldwater Flats and began walking west. She had $16 left after what she would need to spend on supplies. She had the clothes she was wearing. She had a spade that had belonged to her husband Emmett, its handle worn smooth and dark from his hands, its blade nicked along one edge from where he had driven it too hard into rocky soil and laughed about it afterward. She had the memory of that laugh. She had the 300 acres of rock and scrub and failed earth that Emmett had bought in the last optimistic season of his life before the fever took him, before any of his plans had time to become real things in the world. 300 acres, a local joke they called it. The worst parcel in the county. Everyone in the territory knew it. The land was mostly rock shelf and dry scrub, and sitting at the far western edge of it like a monument to disaster was the carcass of a cottonwood tree so enormous that when the storm had finally brought it down 2 winters ago, people in Coldwater Flats had heard the impact from 6 miles away. The fall had torn a wound in the earth, a great jagged pit, where the root system had pulled free of the ground, leaving a cavity large enough to stable 3 horses open to the sky, surrounded by the twisted architecture of roots that rose 20 feet above the soil line and made the whole thing look from a distance like the ruins of something that had once been alive and magnificent. Emmett had loved that tree. He had written to Vera about it before she came west to marry him, describing it in a letter she still kept folded in the inner pocket of her coat. He had called it the king of the whole parcel. He had said it would be the first thing they saw every morning when they stepped outside. He had not known the storm was coming. Vera walked the 6 miles to the western edge of the claim in just under 2 hours. The sky was clear and cold, the kind of October sky that looks innocent, right up until the moment it does not. The grass along the track was the color of old straw. A hawk worked a long, slow circle above the scrub to the north. She did not hurry. She had nowhere to arrive at except the place she was going, and no one was ahead of her, and no one was behind her, and the silence of the Wyoming high plains was the specific silence of a place that does not care what you do next. She reached the cottonwood at mid-afternoon. Standing at the edge of the root pit looking down into it, she understood for the first time what Emmett had seen in this land. Not the practicality, not the agricultural value which was limited, but the scale of it. The tree had been old when the territory was young. Its root system extended outward from the base in every direction, thick as a man's waist, where they emerged from the soil, tapering gradually as they reached into the earth at angles that suggested decades of slow, purposeful reaching. The fall had exposed the underside of all of it, and where the roots curved down into the cavity they had made, the soil was dark and deep, held in place by the root structures above, protected on 3 sides by walls of packed earth, and on the fourth by the massive trunk itself, which lay along the ground like a fallen wall and made a natural roof over a significant section of the pit. The smell was damp earth and clay, and something else beneath both of those things, something older, stone and dark water and time. Vera slid down into the hollow. The descent was about 8 feet from the lip of the pit to the deepest section of the floor. She stood in the lowest part of it and looked up through the lattice of roots at the sky, which was already beginning to shift from blue toward the pale gray of late afternoon. And then she noticed the warmth. It was not dramatic. It was not a furnace. It was simply that the air inside the hollow was measurably, undeniably warmer than the air above. She reached one hand up over the edge of the pit and held it there, then brought it back down to the level of her chest. The difference was perhaps 15 degrees, maybe more. The dead wood of the trunk held the day's accumulated heat and radiated it back slowly. The walls of packed earth insulated against the wind. The root lattice above broke the cold air current without stopping the light. She had not planned this. She had not known this would be here. But standing in the warmth of that ruined space, something shifted in her chest. Not hope. Not yet. Something earlier than hope. Something harder. She remembered Emmett telling her once, sitting on the porch of the claim shack before the fever, talking about nothing in particular, talking about the way heat moved through materials. He had been thinking out loud the way he did. He had said that dead wood holds heat longer than you would think. He had said it the same way he said things that pleased him, with a kind of quiet satisfaction, as if the world had just done something clever. Same reason you bury seed rather than scatter it on the surface. The ground keeps what the air gives away. Vera had not thought about that conversation since the day he said it. She had not needed it until now. but she had kept it somewhere the way you keep a tool in a shed without knowing when you will want it, and here it was waiting. She did not build a fire that first night. She did not have the wood for it, not yet. She pulled her coat tight and curled into the deepest curve of the root hollow where the trunk met the earth wall on the north side, and she let the warmth of the dead cottonwood and the insulated earth do what they were already doing, and she slept better than she had any right to expect. In the morning she began to understand what she had. The work started before full light. Vera had one tool and one intention, and she put the spade into the soft loam of the hollow floor and began. The first 2 feet came easily dark, rich earth that crumbled away in satisfying chunks. Then the spade hit clay. Dense, compact, the color of dried rust, stubborn in the way that good clay is stubborn, which is to say, utterly and without apology. She learned things quickly that first morning. She learned that driving the spade straight down was less effective than angling it slightly and using leverage rather than force. She learned that wetting the clay face with water from the skin she carried made it shave away in cleaner sheets. She learned that her shoulders gave out before her legs did, and that switching from overhead digging to sideways cutting gave the overworked muscles time to recover without stopping the work entirely. She hauled the excavated material up out of the pit in a burlap sack, one load at a time, dragging it 50 paces away before dumping it, building a low mound that would not slide back into what she was making. The blister on her right palm opened by mid-morning. She wrapped it with the strip torn from her underskirt and kept working. By midday she had deepened the main chamber by 1.5 feet and widened it significantly on the south side where the root lattice overhead was thickest and provided the best natural ceiling. She ate a small amount of the dried meat she had carried with her, drank water, looked at what she had done, and went back to it. There is a particular kind of knowledge that only comes through repetition and physical contact. Vera began to acquire it on that second afternoon. She learned the difference between the soft loam and the clay, not by sight but by the resistance she felt through the handle of the spade. She learned where the soil was weak and where it would hold. She learned to read the small signs, a change in color, a shift in smell, a subtle difference in the way sound moved in the enclosed space, that told her what the earth wanted to do if left alone, and what it would tolerate if she insisted. She was not building shelter, not yet. She was having a conversation with the ground. On the third day she was 3 miles into her excavation work when she heard something at the edge of the hollow. She turned. A dog stood at the rim of the pit looking down at her. It was a medium-sized animal of indeterminate breed, built lean and low to the ground, its coat the color of dark ash in the places where it was not matted with mud and burrs. It was thin in the way of an animal that has been surviving rather than living ribs, visible beneath the coat hip bones showing. It stood very still and watched her with an expression that was not quite hope and not quite desperation, something between the two. Vera looked at it for a moment. Then she reached into her coat pocket, found a piece of dried meat, and threw it up over the rim. The dog caught it from the air and swallowed it without chewing. It took one step closer to the edge, stopped, and sat down. "That is all there is," Vera said. Her voice was rough from disuse. She had not spoken to anyone in 3 days. She turned back to her work. When she climbed out of the hollow at dusk, the dog was lying 10 feet away watching her. When she descended into the hollow for the night, she heard it settle near the rim above her. In the morning it was still there. She threw it another piece of meat and did not name it. By the 5th day she had named it Flint, because it was the color of a struck flint in the right light, and because she needed to call it something when she noticed it circling away from a section of brush that turned out on investigation to contain a large and recently active badger burrow. The dog had steered her away from it without making a sound. That kind of quiet usefulness deserved a name. At the end of the first week, she needed supplies. The walk back to Coldwater Flats took 2 hours. She made it in the morning early enough that the light was still coming in at an angle from the east, and the shadows were long. She carried herself the way she always carried herself, which was to say straight. She had always stood straight even as a girl, not from vanity, but from some internal architecture that refused to bend unless it had to. The town had not forgotten her. She felt the attention on her as she moved along the main track toward Foss Mercantile, the way attention feels when it is mostly pity mixed with curiosity, the particular social weight of a community that has written a story about you and is waiting to see if you will confirm it. She kept her eyes forward and her pace steady. Foss Mercantile was the only supply point within 50 miles in any direction. Leonard Foss had run it for 11 years. He was a lean man in his late 50s with the careful economy of movement of someone who has spent years working in a confined space and learned not to waste effort. He wore spectacles and kept his ledger with the precision of a man who understood that the difference between a settlement that thrived and one that collapsed was often a question of whether anyone was tracking the numbers accurately. He looked up when Vera came in. He looked back down at his ledger. He did not make a show of either recognizing her or not recognizing her. She placed her list on the worn counter. Salt. 100 feet of wire, a new spade head, 3 candles and a small lantern with oil. He read the list without comment. His eyes moved down the items with the detached efficiency of someone calculating the total before he finished reading. Hard piece of ground your husband left you, he said without looking up. The voice was flat, not unkind, not kind. Observational. It has its uses, Vera said. He looked up at that. Not for long, just a moment of reevaluation, the way a person recalibrates slightly when they hear something they did not expect. Then he went about gathering her items from the shelves behind him. The total came to $4 and some change. She counted it out in coins onto the counter, every denomination exact, no fumbling. He wrapped the items in brown paper and slid the package across to her. Neither of them said anything further. She picked up the package and left. She could feel the conversation starting up behind her as the door closed. She did not need to hear it to know what it contained. She walked the 6 miles back to the claim with the supplies on her back and Flint padding alongside her and the October sun moving west ahead of her, and she thought about water. The problem of water was the problem that would kill her before winter arrived if she did not solve it. The nearest reliable water source was a small creek 2 miles north of the claim, and 2 miles of difficult terrain in a Wyoming winter in snow that could reach waist height with temperatures that could drop to 40 below was not a problem, it was an impossibility. She needed water on the claim itself or as close to it as the land would allow. She had noticed in her first week of digging that rainfall did not simply disappear from the surface of the land around the root hollow. It ran. It gathered in the low places, followed the angles of the terrain, collected briefly in the depressions before draining. The question was where it drained to. She spent an afternoon after a moderate rainfall following water. There was a natural fissure in the rock shelf that formed the eastern boundary of the hollow, a crack about 4 inches wide and running vertically through the face of the stone. After rainwater sheeted down the rock face and found this crack and disappeared into it. The crack ran through the base of the shelf and emerged, Vera discovered after a careful hour of investigation, about 40 feet to the south, where it seeped out through the clay subsoil and vanished into the ground. She dug. It took 2 days to excavate a channel that captured the seepage point and redirected the water into a containment basin. She cut into the clay at the base of the south wall of the hollow. She lined the basin with the smoothest flat stones she could find, then spent most of a morning packing the walls and floor with wet clay, working it with her palms until the surface was dense and nearly seamless. She let it dry for a day in the weak October sun. The next rainfall filled the basin with 8 inches of clean water. Vera stood looking at it for a long time without moving. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no one to share it with and nothing to mark it except the fact that she had looked at a problem from every angle she could find and then moved her hands until the problem changed shape. That was all. That was enough. She set snares along the game trails she had identified during her first 2 weeks of walking the land. She made the loops from the wire she had bought at Foss, simple slip knots suspended at the right height from small stakes positioned along the narrow corridors where brush forced small animals into predictable paths. The first 3 days, the snares caught nothing. On the fourth day, one held a rabbit. She ate half of it that evening and preserved the rest, and she cured the skin, and she thought about what she had done. She had found a rabbit trail by paying attention. She had built a snare from wire and knowledge. She had eaten without spending $1. It was a small thing. It was also a proof of something she needed proving to herself. The currency she was operating in was not money. Not yet. It was observation and patience and the willingness to do the slow, unglamorous work that nobody would witness or celebrate. It was a currency she was learning to acquire. By the end of October, she had expanded the main chamber of the hollow to roughly 10 feet by 12. The walls were packed clay and stone, reinforced wherever she found weakness. The great trunk of the fallen cottonwood remained her roof, its mass formidable overhead seasoned wood that flexed slightly in heavy wind but held. She carved a small fire pit near the north wall, shaping it with the pickaxe she found stored among Emmett's tools in the flat area behind the root system. The chimney problem occupied her for 3 days. She needed smoke out and heat in, and the standard solutions required materials she did not have. What she had was a vertical crack in the rock face at the back of the deepest section of the chamber, a natural fissure about 6 inches wide that ran upward through the stone and emerged, she established, by sending smoke toward it with a piece of burning cloth at the surface 8 feet above. She cleared the fissure of debris with a long branch wrapped at one end with wire. The first fire she lit in the pit sent its smoke up through the crack in a thin, steady column visible from the surface, drawing cleanly, pulling the combustion gases up and away without backfilling the chamber. The first heat from that fire was a revelation. The stone walls absorbed it slowly and released it back slowly, so that long after she banked the fire to embers, the temperature in the chamber stayed above what it was outside. She sat with her back against the east wall and felt the warmth moving through the stone behind her, and thought about the geometry of it. The earth above insulated. The wood of the trunk insulated, the stone walls stored and returned. She was not fighting the cold. She was working with the properties of the materials that surrounded her. She thought about Emmett. She thought about the way he had talked about the land on their last good evening together before the cough started getting worse. He had talked about learning to read ground the way you learn to read a person, looking for what it was trying to tell you. looking past what you expected to see. His father, a Pennsylvania mining man named Josiah Crane, had taught him that, had taken him down into the earth as a boy, and shown him how to read the strata, how to know what a rock formation had been doing for the last 10,000 years just by looking at the angles it presented. The land doesn't owe you anything, Emmett had told her once, but it doesn't lie to you either. If you want to know what it's thinking, you have to stop projecting what you want onto it and look at what is actually there. She missed him in a way that was not sharp anymore, but had become structural. The way a healed break is still in the bone and will always be there, felt on cold mornings and at moments when the world presented itself in a way that would have made him stop and point. She began attempting to make brick in early November. The motivation was simple. She had an abundance of clay. Clay had uses beyond insulation and waterproofing. If she could produce something she could sell, she could replenish her cash reserves without making the trip to Coldwater Flats dependent on what she could carry back with her. She had watched buildings go up in her lifetime. She understood that foundation, material, durable, brick-fired clay was a commodity. She understood that if she could produce it at low cost from materials already on the claim, she had the beginning of something. The first batch was a failure. She formed 12 blocks by hand and left them in the October sun. They cracked along the surface as they dried hairline fractures at first, then wider until half of them crumbled into segments, and the other half were structurally compromised. She tried mixing in dried grass to add tensile strength. The resulting bricks held together better in the drying phase, but proved brittle under any significant impact, fragmenting along the grass fiber lines. She built a small kiln structure against the exterior rock face on the east side of the hollow, using loose stones as walls and clay mortar. She placed the best of her second batch inside, built a fire underneath, and sealed the entrance with a clay plug. She kept the fire for 20 hours. When she broke the kiln open the next morning, the bricks had blackened and split. The thermal shock had been too rapid. The clay had not had whatever it needed to hold together under that kind of heat. She sat with that failure for a while. Then she went back to work on expanding the chamber and stacking firewood and running her snares. And she let the brick problem sit in the back of her mind, while she did other things the way she had learned to let hard problems sit when direct attention was not resolving them. Sometimes the answer to a thing arrived when you stopped looking directly at it and worked beside it for a while. 3 weeks into November, she found the limestone. She had been extending the back wall of the chamber, cutting deeper into the rock face to create a small storage alcove. The pickaxe moved through the usual dark shale and packed clay, and then struck something different, softer. The sound it made was different, a duller impact, less ring and more thud. She cleared the loose material away with her hands, and found a seam of pale stone running horizontally through the face of the rock, chalky white with a texture that crumbled slightly under pressure from her thumb. She knew what it was. Leonard Foss had mentioned limestone deposits in the area, once commenting on the difficulty they caused for the farmers who tried to plow through them. A nuisance for plowing, useful for mortar if you had the patience to process it. She had heard those words and filed them away and not thought of them again until this moment. She thought of Emmett. Emmett had told her once about his father's work in the limestone country of Pennsylvania, about how they would process the rock, burning it down to a fine powder, and how that powder changed the properties of other building materials when it was incorporated into them. He had explained the chemistry of it as best a non-chemist could, the way the calcined powder reacted with water and created bonds that pure clay could not achieve on its own. Limestone and clay together make something neither can make alone. She could hear Emmett's voice saying it. She could hear the particular tone of it, the quiet satisfaction he took in knowing things that intersected with each other in useful ways. She had no teacher. She had no materials beyond what the land had placed directly in front of her. She had no equipment beyond a pickaxe and a spade and a kiln built from loose stones. She had a memory. She broke off a piece of the limestone seam and held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. It was not heavy, it was not impressive to look at. It was pale and slightly chalky, and sat in her palm like a piece of ordinary stone that had simply not gotten around to hardening properly. She thought about the two failed batches of bricks. She thought about the fire that had cracked them. She thought about what was missing from the process she had tried, and she thought about what Emmett's father had known that she did not, and she thought about the fact that she had nothing left to lose by trying again. She put the limestone in her coat pocket. She walked back around to the fire pit inside the chamber and set another piece of wood on the coals. Flint was lying near the pit entrance, his head on his front paws, his eyes tracking her as she moved. Outside, the wind had picked up from the northwest, the beginning of a change in weather that Vera had been reading in the sky since mid-afternoon. She sat down on the packed earth floor and looked at the firelight moving on the stone walls, and she thought about what she was going to do next. Not next week, not in the spring, tomorrow, the day after, the slow, careful work of the days immediately ahead. She had $16 and change left in the cloth pouch she kept in her coat. She had a water supply. She had a shelter that was not finished but was already better than 3/4 of what she had seen people living in when she first came west. She had snares producing every 2 to 3 days. She had an ember of an idea about limestone and clay that needed testing. She had something else that she was only beginning to understand the value of. She had 6 weeks of intimate knowledge of this specific ground. She knew where the water moved after rain. She knew where the soil gave way to rock, and where the rock gave way to clay, and where the clay lay over limestone seams that ran, God knew how far in any direction. She knew the game trails and the wind patterns, and the way sound behaved differently in the hollow than in the open air above. She knew this ground in the particular way that comes only from having put your hands into it every single day, from having read it, not through instruments or surveys or the accounts of other people, but through contact. The land doesn't lie to you, Emmett had said. You just have to be willing to listen long enough. She had only just started listening. Outside, the wind moved through the scrub oak with a low, sustained note, and Flint raised his head briefly and then put it back down, and the fire in the pit dropped to a deep orange bed of coals that would hold heat until morning, and Vera Crane lay down on her bed of pine boughs in the hollow of the great fallen cottonwood tree on the worst 300 acres in Wyoming territory, and she slept. She spent 3 days processing the limestone before she attempted a third batch of bricks. The work of it was slow and physical in a way that was different from digging. Digging asked for endurance. This asked for precision. She broke the soft limestone from the seam in chunks, using the pickaxe carried the chunks outside to a flat section of rock shelf she had cleared of debris and began reducing them to powder, using a heavy rounded stone as a pestle and the flat shelf itself as a mortar. The limestone was soft enough that it yielded to pressure without requiring full force, crumbling into a pale, chalky dust that caught the November light and made her hands look like a baker's hands, white to the wrist, leaving prints on everything she touched. Flint watched from a distance, mildly interested and then not. She ground for 2 full days, stopping when the light failed, sleeping, rising before dawn to continue. By the end of the second day, she had a quantity of powder she judged sufficient for a test batch. She mixed it into wet clay at what felt like a reasonable proportion, working the two materials together with her hands until the color shifted from the red rust of the clay alone to something more complex, pale threads running through the darker material, the whole thing taking on a different texture as the limestone dust distributed itself through the clay body. She formed 6 bricks. She was careful with the forming, pressing the material firmly into the shapes she had learned to make, eliminating air pockets, ensuring the density was as even as she could manage by hand. She left them to dry in the shelter of the root hollow for a full day, turning them once to expose the bottom faces to the air. Then she built the fire. She had improved the kiln structure since the second failure, adding a layer of clay daub to the interior walls to moderate the rate of heat transfer, and building the fire in stages rather than all at once, coaxing the temperature up slowly rather than driving it hard from the start. She sealed the bricks inside with the clay plug and fed the fire for 2 days, sleeping in short intervals, waking to add wood, monitoring the color of the heat visible through a small inspection gap she had left near the base. On the morning of the third day she let the fire die and the kiln cool. She waited a full additional day before breaking the seal, because she had learned that the cracking in her previous batches had happened partly during the cooling phase, and that patience in the final hours was as important as anything else in the process. When she reached into the cooled kiln and drew out the first brick, it was ugly. There was no other word for it. It was warped along one face and slightly twisted at the corners, and the color was uneven darker where it had been closer to the heat source, lighter at the far end. It looked like something a person made who had never made a brick before, and had no teacher, and was working from the residue of a half-remembered conversation. She held it in both hands and looked at it. Then she set it on the flat rock shelf and picked up a smaller stone and struck it. The brick did not break. She struck it again, harder. It did not break. It rang, not the dull, flat sound of under-fired clay. A clear tone, brief, almost musical, the sound of a material that had been through fire and come out the other side as something new. She sat down on the rock shelf and held the brick in her lap and looked at the sky for a while without thinking about anything in particular. Flint came over and sniffed the brick and then sat beside her. She loaded all 6 bricks into a sack 2 days later and walked to Coldwater Flats. The mercantile was quiet when she came in. Foss was behind the counter, writing in his ledger. He looked up, looked at the sack, looked back at her face. She set the sack on the counter and took out one of the bricks and placed it in front of him. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands. He said nothing for a moment. Then he reached under the counter and brought out a small hammer, the kind used for tacking crates, and gave the brick a sharp, clean blow on its widest face. The brick held. The blow left a faint white mark on the surface and nothing else. He set it down and looked at it for a moment longer. "Good for hearths," he said, 10 cents apiece. That was 60 cents for all 6. It was not a fortune. It was not even close to a fortune. But Vera walked back to the claim that afternoon, understanding something that she had not understood when she set out in the morning. She understood that she had converted limestone and clay and time into money, using nothing but her hands and her memory of a dead man's words. She understood that the claim was not just shelter, It was a source of materials she had not yet fully inventoried, and she understood that 10 cents a brick was a beginning, not a ceiling. She went back to the kiln. The days shortened, and the light changed its angle, and the air developed the particular edge that people who have spent winters on the Wyoming high plains learn to read the way a sailor reads water. Not cold yet, not the real cold, but the announcement of cold, the preparatory weeks during which the world seems to be setting its affairs in order before the serious business begins. Vera set a rhythm for herself. Morning she dug and built, extending the chamber, reinforcing the walls, adding a low stone bench along the south wall that doubled as sleeping platform and heat storage mass. Afternoons she processed limestone and mixed clay and tended the kiln. 2 evenings a week she walked her snare lines, which she had expanded from the original half-dozen to nearly 30 set at intervals along every game trail she had identified across the eastern two-thirds of the claim. She went to Coldwater Flats twice a month. She carried bricks and came back with supplies, and she conducted these transactions with Foss in the same way she had conducted the first one, without complaint or explanation or any request for acknowledgment beyond the commercial exchange itself. She took note of what he was short on and what he had in excess. She took note of what people came in asking for while she was there. She kept to herself. She did not try to make herself known in the settlement. She did not try to convince anyone of anything. She simply appeared on her schedule and did her business and left, and she let what she was building speak for itself, which at this stage meant it was not speaking to anyone at all. The silence was intentional. The people of Coldwater Flats, in the absence of information, supplied their own. She heard fragments of it on her visits, the kind of half-muffled conversation that people do not bother to lower quite enough because they have not truly considered that the person they are discussing might have the same functional hearing as everyone else. She heard theories about money hidden away by Emmett before his death. She heard the suggestion that no woman could manage alone out on that claim, and therefore something else must explain it, something unrespectable, some transaction not being disclosed. She did not respond to any of it. There was no response adequate to ignorance of that particular kind, and spending energy on it was spending energy she needed elsewhere. She had learned to treat the town's opinion of her the way she treated weather. Acknowledge it, account for it, and then work anyway. In the second week of November, she walked to her primary clay deposit on the northern edge of the claim and found it filled with cattle dung. Not accidentally, not the casual deposit of a stray animal passing through. Someone had worked at this, had collected and hauled and dumped deliberately, had chosen this specific location which was not visible from any public track, and had destroyed a week's worth of accessible clay in an afternoon. She stood at the edge of the deposit and looked at it for a long time without moving. Then she walked the entire perimeter of the claim before returning to the hollow, reading the ground for signs of recent passage. She found boot tracks in the soft soil near the eastern fence line, 2 sets made within the last 24 hours. She noted the tread pattern, the stride length, the depth of impression. She noted which direction they came from and which direction they left. She filed it all away without drawing a conclusion aloud even to herself. The following week she walked her snare lines in the early morning and found every one of them sprung and emptied, the wire loops straightened, the wooden toggle stakes pulled and laid flat on the ground. Not the work of an animal, the work of hands. Careful work, methodical, thorough, every snare on the line, every one. She stood at the end of the line where it met the scrub oak thicket and looked back along the trail she had walked. 30 snares. representing 2 weeks of setting and positioning and adjusting, representing perhaps $4 worth of food over the coming month. Gone. She went back to the hollow and sat down inside the chamber and did not light the lamp. The darkness was complete. Flint came and lay down against her side, his warmth a small, steady pressure. She sat with her hands in her lap and felt the weight of it, not just this particular setback, but all of it together. The 2 months of unwitnessed effort, the blistered hands and the aching shoulders, and the mornings when the temperature inside the chamber was colder than she expected because the fire had gone out in the night. The loneliness that she had been managing successfully until this moment, but that was now presenting itself fully, not as an emotion exactly, but as a physical condition, a kind of gravity that pulled everything toward the floor. She reached out in the dark and found the handle of the spade where it leaned against the wall. She held it with both hands. The wood was smooth under her palms, worn to the specific topography of a man's grip, over many years. Emmett's grip, the pressure points and calloused places of his particular way of holding it, recorded permanently in the grain of the wood. She held it and did not say anything and did not try to think of a solution and did not try to be strong. She let herself feel the size of what she was trying to do and the smallness of herself against it, and she let that be what it was without managing it. Flint shifted and pressed his head more firmly against her ribs. After a while she thought about what Emmett had told her the last coherent evening before the fever took his ability to have conversations. He had been looking at the ceiling and talking in the slow, careful way of someone who knows they may not have many more opportunities for slow, careful talk. He had said that land does not deceive. He had said that people deceive and weather deceives, and your own expectations deceive you constantly, but the ground itself simply is what it is, and if you pay close enough attention, it will show you exactly what it contains, and exactly what it is capable of, and exactly what it requires from you in return. He had said that was more than you could claim about most things in a man's life. She sat with that for a while longer. Then she stood up and lit the lamp. In the morning she found a new clay deposit in the scrub oak thicket 200 yards south of the original site. She had noticed the coloration of the soil there weeks ago, but had not followed it because the original deposit was more accessible. Now accessible no longer meant what it had meant. She spent an afternoon evaluating the new deposit and found it adequate, the clay a slightly different composition from what she had been using, requiring minor adjustments to her limestone ratio, but workable. She returned to the original site and cleared the contaminated material methodically over 3 days, hauling it away in the same burlap sacks she had used for her initial excavations. She told no one. She made no accusation. She simply relocated her operation and reinforced her snare lines further from any common path and began conducting a quiet daily patrol of the claim's boundaries with Flint at first light and again at dusk. She built the low stone wall around the natural spring and the primary water channel not high enough to be a statement but solid enough to be a fact. She was not building walls to keep people out. She was building a record of what was hers and what she had made of it, a record written in stone and clay that would outlast any conversation about whether a woman alone could hold land in the Wyoming Territory. She was in the middle of her third firing of the improved brick formula, a larger batch this time, 16 bricks, when the cold arrived in earnest. It did not arrive the way cold usually arrived, gradually, incrementally, giving you time to adjust your preparations in response to its advance. It arrived the way serious cold arrives on the high plains, sometimes as a wall, as a transition between one world and another with almost no threshold between them. One afternoon the sky was the pale winter blue it had been for weeks, cold but navigable. By evening it had changed to the specific purple gray that people who have spent time at altitude learn to read with the same attention they give to sound in the dark. The temperature dropped 20 degrees between sunset and full dark. The wind came in from the northwest with a purpose that was different from ordinary winter wind. It was not gusting, it was sustained. It had decided on a direction and was committed to it, and the sound it made moving through the root lattice above the hollow was a low, continuous note that Vera felt as much as heard a vibration in the timber of the overhead roots that told her about mass and velocity in terms she understood in her body, if not in numbers. She had an hour of workable conditions remaining. She used them. She brought in every piece of firewood she had stacked outside the hollow, carrying armload after armload down into the chamber until the wood was stacked against the north wall from floor to ceiling in a column 4 feet wide. She pulled the canvas across the entrance and weighted its lower edge with the heaviest stones she could drag in the dark. She checked the chimney fissure and cleared a small debris accumulation near the top that she had been planning to address the following week. She filled every container she had with water from the basin before it could freeze. She brought Flint inside. Then she built the fire up not to its maximum but to a steady medium that she could maintain for days without exhausting her wood supply, and she settled in. The blizzard lasted 4 days. On the first day she could hear it above her as a kind of roar, intermittent surging and easing and surging again. On the second day the roar became continuous, and she could feel the pressure of it in her ears. When the wind direction shifted a slight change in the air pressure inside the chamber that told her the storm above was doing something large and sustained. The temperature inside the chamber stayed bearable. She fed the fire on its measured schedule. She ate carefully from her store's rationing without panic, calculating what she had against what she would need without allowing the calculation to become frightening. On the third night the sound changed. A deep, slow creaking began in the wood of the cottonwood trunk above her, a structural sound. The sound of something massive accommodating a load it had not been designed to carry. She lay on the stone bench and listened to it, and did not sleep for most of that night. Flint was pressed against the full length of her body, both of them still listening to the same sounds. She thought about the tree, about the species of wood and the density of it dried hard over 2 winters since the fall, about the root system that was anchoring the whole structure at both ends, holding it against both the downward pressure of the snow accumulation above and the lateral pressure of the wind that was trying to push it. She thought about whether there was anything she could do if the trunk gave way and concluded there was not. And so she stopped thinking about it and listened to the creaking and let the fire do what it was doing and waited for morning. The trunk held. On the 5th morning she woke to silence. Not quiet. Silence. The difference is the difference between an absence of sound and the presence of a specific kind of stillness that has weight and texture. She lay still for a moment and felt it, and then understood what it meant. The wind was gone. The storm had passed. She dressed and pulled on her coat and went to the entrance. The canvas was pressed inward by the weight of snow accumulated against it, and she had to push against it to create enough give to work her way out. She came out through a wall of packed snow into a morning that was so bright it was almost painful, the sun on the unbroken white surface of the world producing a light so intense she had to shade her eyes with both hands and look toward the ground to begin adjusting. The snow was deep, 4 feet on the open ground, deeper in the drifts chest high where the wind had pushed it against the exposed faces of the rock shelf. The world above the hollow was completely transformed. The scrub oak, the rock outcroppings, the fence-line posts that marked the eastern boundary. Everything was altered, reduced to smooth white shapes that bore only a conceptual relationship to what she knew was underneath. The hollow entrance itself was buried to the point of invisibility. From above, standing on the surface, there was nothing to indicate that anything was down there. The root system was loaded with snow and ice, yes, but the chamber below was dry. The fire pit still held coals. The water containers were intact. The wood supply was substantially depleted but not exhausted. She needed supplies. The 6 miles to Coldwater Flats took most of a day in the snow. She moved steadily and did not rush, and she did not fall, though there were sections where the drifts were nearly impassable and she had to work her way around them or climb through them by main force. Flint found his own route through most of it, moving ahead of her and then circling back, carving a trail she could follow. She came into the settlement in the early afternoon. The light was already starting to go. What she saw when she crossed the first line of structures stopped her for a moment in a way that very few things had stopped her in the preceding weeks. The roof of the livery stable had failed completely. The entire center section had come down driven by snow load, and the collapse had killed both horses that had been inside and injured the man who had gone in to check on them before the worst of the storm arrived. The structure was a ruin, the roof material now part of the interior, the walls splayed outward under the impact, the whole thing open to the sky in a way that made it look like something that had been struck from above, rather than merely overwhelmed from above. 3 of the homestead cabins on the northern edge of the settlement were demolished. Not damaged. Demolished. Their walls had gone out before their roofs came down, which suggested they had been under-chinked and had let the wind in, and once the wind was inside, the pressure differential had done the rest in a matter of minutes. The contents of one of them were partially visible through the wreckage, furniture, and bedding, and a lifetime of small possessions distributed across the snow in a radius of 60 feet. 2 men had died. She heard it from a woman outside the mercantile, a neighbor who had come to check on Foss after the storm. The 2 men were prospectors who had been camped in a tent structure on the eastern edge of the settlement, men who had spent winters in harder country than this, and who had considered their setup adequate. The tent had not held. They had been found the following morning by a neighbor who had gone out to check. Vera stood with this information for a moment. She thought about the 4 days she had spent underground in the root hollow of a fallen cottonwood on the worst 300 acres in the county. She thought about the deep creaking of the trunk on the 3rd night, and the way she had lain still and listened and waited. She thought about the way the snow had pressed the canvas inward at the entrance, and the way she had pushed back against it and come out into the silence of the aftermath. She thought about what the ground had given her by simply being what it was, cold and deep and insulating and honest, and about what she had done to work with those properties rather than against them. She went into the mercantile. Foss was behind the counter. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her for a moment in a way that was different from the way he usually looked at her, a moment of recognition that went beyond the commercial. She had walked 6 miles through chest-high drifts to stand in his doorway, which told him something about what the preceding 4 days had been like for her, and also something about her general disposition toward difficulty. He did not say anything. He turned and took down the coffee pot from the small stove behind the counter and poured a cup and set it on the worn wood surface in front of her. She wrapped both hands around it and felt the heat move through her palms. They stood in silence for a moment, separated by the counter, the mercantile quiet around them, with the particular quiet of a place that had just come through something hard and was still in the early moments of taking stock. She bought what she needed and walked back. December became January in the way that months become other months on the Wyoming High Plains, which is to say, the transition was invisible, and the cold was the cold, and the only evidence of change was the slight shift in the angle of the midday sun that you would not notice unless you had been watching for it. Vera had been watching for it. She watched for every kind of shift. It was part of the work now. She produced bricks through January larger batches as she refined her technique, the limestone proportion becoming more precise with each firing, the brick density improving, the failure rate dropping from roughly 1 in 4 to roughly 1 in 12. She carried them to Coldwater Flats on her twice-monthly schedule, and Foss bought them without ceremony, and the money accumulated in the cloth pouch in her coat pocket with the slow steadiness of something that is growing, because the conditions for growth are present, not because anything dramatic is happening. She expanded her limestone processing operation and discovered in the middle of January that the seam she had found in the back wall of the chamber extended further than she had initially assumed. She had followed it perhaps 8 feet when she first found it. She now followed it in the opposite direction, cutting carefully along its face, and found that it ran at least 30 feet in the horizontal plane, and that the depth of it was as yet unmeasured. It was more material than she could process in a decade of solitary work. It was far more than she had imagined when she first struck it with the pickaxe. She said nothing about this to anyone. February was cold in the straightforward way. February is cold on the high plains comprehensively and without apology, and Vera worked through it with the same consistency she had brought to October and November and December. She was not comfortable. Comfort was not the standard she was applying. The standard she was applying was survivable, and survivable was being met, and she had long since made her peace with the distance between those two conditions. In the middle of February, on a morning when the temperature was low enough that her breath hung in the chamber air even with the fire going, she walked the eastern boundary of the claim at dawn and found the fence posts marking the corner of the property had been pulled out of the ground, not by frost heave. The soil around the base of each post was cut cleanly, the way it looks when a tool has been used rather than when weather has done the work. The posts were not lying nearby, they had been taken. She stood at the place where the corner posts had been and looked at the undisturbed snow around the removal point and felt something she had not felt during the clay deposit fouling or the snare destruction. She felt a clarifying anger, not hot, cold, the specific cold of a person who has been patient for a long time and is now revising her assessment of how much patience the situation actually requires. She reset the corner with new posts she cut from scrub oak, drove them deeper than the originals, set them in clay that she poured liquid around the base and allowed to freeze. She marked each post with 3 cuts on the face, her own mark, and she walked the entire boundary line before she went back to the hollow, noting every variation from what it should look like and photographing it in her memory. Then she went back to work. She had 30 bricks ready for delivery in the last week of February, the largest single batch she had produced. She made the trip to Foss on a Thursday morning, the sky clear and sharp, the temperature beginning its first tentative movement towards something that could be called thaw if you were generous with the word. She loaded the bricks into the 2 bags she had made for carrying them 20 pounds each and walked the 6 miles with Flint. She was turning to leave after the transaction when one of the other men in the mercantile, a homesteader named Giddens, whose place was 4 miles north of the settlement, said something to the other man he was standing with. Not loud, but not quiet enough. Said she must have found herself a man out there, the one doing the actual work. She stopped walking. She did not turn around. She was aware of the quality of stillness that had come into the room, the kind of stillness that arrives when everyone present understands that a thing has been said that cannot be unsaid and is waiting to find out what happens next. Foss said quietly and without emphasis, "That was 30 bricks she just delivered. Same quality I've been selling out of since November. You want to look at the hearth I built with the first batch, it's right there." He said it the way he said most things, without drama, as a statement of fact addressed to no one in particular, but audible to everyone present. Vera walked out. Vera, she did not feel gratitude exactly. Gratitude was for gifts. What Foss had done was simply tell the truth in a room where a lie was being offered, and you do not owe gratitude for truth, you owe it acknowledgement, and she acknowledged it by continuing to do the work she had been doing, because that was what the truth was about, and that was the only acknowledgement worth offering. March came with its muddy thaw and its false starts, and the first thin green that appears along south-facing slopes before anything else is ready to believe that winter is concluding. Vera watched it. She kept her schedule. She processed limestone and fired bricks and ran her expanded snare line and maintained her water system and walked her boundary patrol with Flint at first light. She was 3 miles into her morning walk on the second Thursday of March when she came around the eastern edge of the rock shelf and stopped. There was a dead animal near the primary water source. A cow recently dead positioned directly upstream of the natural seepage point where her water channel began. It had not wandered there and collapsed. The position was too deliberate for that, the body too specifically placed relative to the water channel for it to be accidental. Someone had brought it there and left it there and intended for her to understand what it meant as a statement about what could happen to a water supply that a woman alone had no practical means of protecting. She looked at the dead animal for a long time. She thought about Harlan Ward, whose name she had first heard from Foss 3 months earlier, mentioned in passing during one of her supply visits as a man who had been acquiring parcels throughout the county with a consistency and a method that suggested long-term planning rather than opportunism. A cattle-baron Foss had said, the kind who sees land not in acres but in water rights and grazing corridors, the kind who does not need to be in a hurry because time works in his favor, as long as the people he is waiting out continue to behave like people he is waiting out. She had filed the name away. She looked at the dead animal, and then she looked at the water channel and the stone wall she had built around the spring head, and the extent of what she had constructed and maintained through 4 months of solitary work. She looked at all of it with the particular attention of a person who is updating an assessment. Then she took off her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and began the slow work of moving the carcass away from the water source. Harlan Ward rode onto the claim on a morning in late March when the ground was soft enough to show every hoof print, and the air smelled of snowmelt and wet sage, and the particular mineral sharpness of limestone exposed by the thaw. He came with two men riding behind him, neither of them speaking, both of them positioned in the way men position themselves when they are present not as companions but as a statement about the kind of man they are accompanying. Ward himself was not what Vera had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. He was in his mid-50s, well-built and composed, wearing a coat that was good quality without being showy, the coat of a man who understood that real authority does not need to advertise itself. His horse was a large, gray, well-tended, moving with the practiced ease of an animal that has been ridden by someone who knows what they are doing for a long time. He dismounted at the edge of the cleared area around the hollow entrance without being asked, which was a practiced courtesy, the kind a man deploys when he wants to establish that he is reasonable before he establishes what he wants. He looked around at what she had built. He took his time doing it. He looked at the low stone wall around the water source, at the improved entrance to the hollow, at the brick kiln structure on the east face of the rock shelf, at the snare stakes visible along the nearest game trail. He looked at all of it the way a man looks at something he is calculating the value of, and then he looked at Vera. "Mrs. Crane," he said. His voice was even and unhurried. "I have heard remarkable things about what you have done here." He said it with the specific warmth of a man who has decided that warmth is the appropriate tool for this particular situation. Not genuine warmth. The other kind, the kind that is constructed and deployed and calibrated to the person it is being aimed at. Vera stood at the entrance to the hollow with Flint beside her and said nothing. She waited. Ward said he had come because he was a direct man who preferred direct conversations, and the direct thing he wanted to say was that he was interested in acquiring her claim. He said he understood the land had been difficult, and that she had worked extraordinarily hard to make something of it, and that what he was prepared to offer reflected his respect for that work. He named a figure. It was more than the land was worth by any conventional assessment. It was more than she would see from brick sales in 3 years at her current production rate. He named it in the tone of a man who has learned that the right number said in the right tone closes most conversations before they become disagreements. Vera looked at him for a moment. Then she said she was not selling. Ward's expression did not change in any significant way. The warmth did not leave it. It simply became slightly more deliberate, the way a fire becomes more deliberate when you add careful wood to it. He said he understood. He said this kind of land got into a person he had seen it before. He said he respected that. He paused in the way of a man who has learned that pauses carry weight. Then he said that this was hard country, and that a woman alone was in a genuinely vulnerable position, and that springs could get contaminated by any number of things, and that fences were always breaking down in this climate, and that it would be a genuine shame to see all the work she had put into this place go to waste. He said it with the same even unhurried voice he had used for everything else. He said it looking directly at her, not away, which was a different kind of cruelty than Dowell Crane's inability to meet her eyes. This was the cruelty of a man who does not need to look away, because he does not believe there is anything in your face capable of affecting him. Flint was not growling. He was simply still in the way of a dog that has assessed a situation and reached a conclusion and is waiting. Vera looked at Harlan Ward and felt the cold anger she had felt at the fence posts in February, the clarifying kind, and she felt something else beneath it that was not anger but was related to it. It was recognition. She had spent 5 months learning to read this ground, to understand what it was telling her beneath the surface, to look past what things appeared to be and find what they actually were. And what Harlan Ward actually was beneath the good coat, and the reasonable voice, and the carefully calibrated offer, was a man who had mistaken her silence for emptiness, and her patience for weakness, and her refusal to perform distress for an absence of it. She said, "This land is mine, Mr. Ward, and I am not leaving it." She said it the way she said most things, without raising her voice, without any of the trappings of confrontation, as a statement of fact about the condition of the world. Ward held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded once politely, the nod of a man filing something under a different category than he had initially assigned it to. He remounted his horse and turned it without urgency and rode back the way he had come, his 2 men behind him, and Vera watched him go and felt her heart working harder than it had been working a few minutes earlier, which was the body's honest account of what had just happened, regardless of what the voice had sounded like while it was happening. She stood at the entrance for a long time after the sound of hooves had gone from the air. Then she went to work. The Colt Mosts in April came on schedule, and Ward's pressure came with them, less direct now, more atmospheric. One morning she found the eastern corner post she had reset in February pulled again, the clay base broken, the post lying flat. The following week 2 of her snares in the southern section were taken entirely, not sprung and emptied, but removed, stakes and wire both gone. A man she did not recognize rode a slow circuit of the claim's visible boundary on a Tuesday afternoon, making no effort to conceal what he was doing, looking at the terrain with the methodical attention of someone who has been asked to inventory it. She noted all of it. She filed it in the same careful mental ledger she used for everything else she had learned about this ground. She did not go to the sheriff in Coldwater Flats because the sheriff in Coldwater Flats was a practical man in a small settlement who understood which direction the large currents of money and land ran, and Vera did not have the kind of evidence that would give him more reason to act on her behalf than to look away on Ward's behalf. What she had was the ground itself. She spent 3 weeks in April doing something she had not done systematically before. She walked every square yard of the 300 acres she owned. Not the boundary line, not the game trails, not the routes she had established between the hollow and the water source and the clay deposits and the kiln. All of it. She walked in systematic parallel lines spaced 20 feet apart, moving east to west across the full extent of the claim, and she looked at everything the ground was showing her about itself. She had been living on this land for 6 months. She knew it the way you know a room you sleep in every night. But there is a difference between the knowledge that comes from habitual daily passage and the knowledge that comes from deliberate systematic examination, and she had not yet done the second kind, and she understood now that she needed to. On the third day she found what she had not known to look for. The limestone seam she had discovered in the back wall of the chamber was not an isolated deposit. She had known that, had followed it 30 feet in one direction and found it still continuing. What she had not understood was the scale of it. Walking the surface of the claim with her full attention directed at the ground rather than the path ahead, she found limestone outcroppings at 6 separate locations spread across the western 2/3 of the property. Small outcroppings, most of them just the edge of the seam, showing through the surface soil, easy to overlook if you were not looking for them, easy to dismiss as ordinary rock if you did not know what to look for in the coloration and texture. But they formed a pattern. They were not random. They were the visible punctuation of a single continuous formation, running diagonally across the full extent of the claim at depth. She followed the pattern, she mapped it in her head, walking from outcropping to outcropping, noting the angles, noting the depth at which the stone appeared relative to the surface at each point. The formation was not horizontal. It tilted, running deeper as it moved east, shallower as it moved west, and at its shallowest western point it came within 18 inches of the surface. She thought about Ward and his water rights. She thought about the seepage spring she had improved and built her water system around the one Ward had mentioned in his careful, threatening voice. The spring was located at the western edge of the claim at the point where the limestone formation came closest to the surface. The water that fed it was not coming from the sky. It was not surface runoff. It was coming from below, from wherever the formation intersected with an aquifer at depth, percolating upward through the porous limestone toward the surface. Ward thought he was negotiating for a spring, a single point source of water in a specific location, the kind of thing that could be argued over in terms of which side of a boundary line it fell, on the kind of thing that a survey and a property map could adjudicate. What he was actually trying to acquire control over was the terminus of a water system that ran through the full length of her property underground. The spring was not a feature of the land the way a rock formation or a timber stand was a feature. It was the exit point of something much larger. Move the boundary argument to the spring, and you lost the spring and gained nothing. Understand what the spring was connected to, and you understood that the argument was about the wrong thing entirely. She sat on the ground at the westernmost limestone outcropping in the late afternoon light of an April day, and held a piece of the pale, chalky stone in her palm, and felt the weight of what she now understood. She knew this ground. She knew it in a way that Harlan Ward, with his surveys and his consultants and his accumulated resources, did not and could not, without years of the specific kind of attention she had been paying since October. He had seen the spring from the outside and assessed it as a valuable isolated feature. He had not spent 6 months with his hands in the soil understanding what the soil was part of. She put the limestone in her coat pocket and walked back to the hollow. Ward came again in the second week of May this time, without the 2 men behind him, which was its own kind of statement. He came alone on the gray horse, and he was, if anything, more composed than he had been in March, which told her that his confidence had not been reduced by her refusal. His confidence came from a different place than the outcome of individual conversations. He said he had been thinking about their previous discussion. He said he had a new proposal he wanted to lay before her, one that he thought took better account of her interests. He said he had had a survey conducted of the boundary area adjacent to the spring, and that the survey indicated the water emergence point was situated in a manner that raised legitimate questions about the precise location of the property line, and that he was prepared to pursue those questions through the appropriate legal channels, but that he would prefer to reach a private agreement with her directly, because that was the kind of man he was. He said it all in the same even voice. He said the part about legal channels without any change in inflection, which was the most threatening way to say it. Vera looked at him. She said she would like to show him something. He waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of the tools in the set. She said she would like to show him where his survey had the argument wrong. She said it without heat as a practical proposition. Something shifted in his expression. Not much. A small recalibration, the kind a careful man makes when a situation has moved outside the parameters he prepared for. He dismounted. She led him west from the hollow entrance toward the spring. Flint walked with them slightly behind Ward, which was Flint's way of positioning himself relative to people he was not certain about. They walked in silence until they reached the stone wall she had built around the spring head, and then she stopped and turned. She said that what his survey had measured was the emergence point of the water, where it reached the surface. She said that a survey measure of an emergence point tells you where water is visible but not where it comes from, or how much of the ground it passes through on its way here. She began walking east from the spring along a line she had mapped in her head during her 3 weeks of systematic ground examination. She moved without hesitation, going directly to the first limestone outcropping, which lay 40 feet east of the spring head, barely visible as a slight discoloration in the soil surface, easy to miss if you did not know it was there. She crouched down and cleared the surface debris from it with her hand and showed Ward the pale, chalky stone beneath. She said this was the same formation that fed the spring. Same material, same seam connected at depth. Then she stood and walked to the next outcropping 60 feet further east and slightly north and showed him that one. Then the next, and the next. She walked him across the full diagonal extent of the limestone formation from the spring head all the way to the eastern edge of the claim, stopping at each surface expression of the underground system, clearing each one briefly with her hand so the stone was visible, saying nothing between stops except the occasional brief observation about depth or angle, or the relationship between what they were looking at and the spring they had started from. It took the better part of an hour. At the final outcropping near the eastern fence line, she stopped and turned to face him. She said the water in that spring came from here. It came from all of this. It traveled through that formation underground for the full length of the claim before it emerged at the surface at the western end. A survey of the emergence point told him where the water came out. What she had just shown him told him where the water came from and how much of the ground it ran through on its way. She said he was welcome to have his attorneys argue about the precise location of the emergence point relative to whatever line his survey established. She said that argument might take months and might cost both of them money they would prefer to spend on other things, but she said that while that argument was proceeding, she would be here on this ground with this formation running under all of it, and the argument would not change that. She said it without emphasis, without anger, without any of the apparatus of confrontation. She said it the way she said things that she had thought through carefully and arrived at from a position of knowledge rather than feeling. Ward stood at the eastern fence line and looked back west along the route she had walked him. She watched him doing the calculation. She could see it happening in the way his eyes moved, not looking at her, but at the terrain, reassembling what he thought he knew about this ground against what he had just been shown. He was a man who had built a significant enterprise on the ability to assess value accurately. He was not a fool. Fools do not accumulate what he had accumulated. And what he was now assessing, she knew, was not just the water rights question, but the larger question of what kind of person he was dealing with, and what kind of problem this had become versus what kind of problem he had initially believed it to be. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, with the tone of a man revising an entry in an internal ledger, that he appreciated her showing him this. He walked back to his horse. He mounted. He settled himself in the saddle and looked at her one more time, and the look was not warm and not hostile, but simply assessing the look of a man who has encountered something he underestimated and is deciding how to categorize it going forward. He nodded once. Then he turned the gray horse and rode west toward the track and did not look back, and Vera watched him go until the dust of his passage thinned and dispersed, and the sound of hooves faded into the general silence of the high plains afternoon. Flint sat beside her. The wind moved through the scrub oak at the eastern fence line with a low, dry sound. The sky was the deep blue of a Wyoming spring afternoon with a few high thin clouds moving from the northwest at altitude. She did not feel triumphant. She had expected to feel something more than this, some resolution that corresponded to the scale of what had been threatening, but what she actually felt was quieter than that. She felt the way the air feels after a sustained wind finally stops. Not the presence of something, the absence of pressure. She stood for another minute in that feeling. Then she walked back to the hollow. Foss was in his mercantile 3 days later when she came in for supplies. He was not alone. Two of the regular customers who spent their mornings there were Present Giddens and a man named Hartwell, who ran sheep on a parcel 2 miles east of town. When Vera came through the door, they both looked at her with the expression of men who have recently received information that has adjusted their understanding of something. Foss said, without looking up from his ledger, that Ward's man had been in yesterday, asking about the limestone deposits on the western parcels, and whether anyone had surveyed the subsurface geology of that section of the county. He said it in his flat, observational voice directed at the ledger, addressed to no one, audible to everyone. Hartwell said that Ward was not a man who asked questions unless the answers mattered to him. Foss did not respond to this. He finished what he was writing and looked up at Vera. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her since November, with the specific attention of a man who is watching a process unfold and has decided to withhold judgment until he has seen more of it. He had been withholding judgment for 6 months now. She could see that he had arrived somewhere. He said she had 12 bricks coming from last week's delivery at 10 cents. She said she had 20 this time and that the quality on the last 4 batches had been consistent enough that she thought the price warranted a conversation. There was a pause. Foss looked at her. Then he said 12 cents. She said 11 was where she would be comfortable. He said done and went back to his ledger. Giddens, who had been watching this exchange with the particular attention of a man who is recalculating something, said he had a hearth at his place that had been poorly built and had been smoking badly all winter, and he asked whether she would be willing to look at it and tell him what she thought the problem was. She said she could do that. He said he would pay for her time and for any materials needed. The exchange was brief and businesslike and entirely unremarkable, which was exactly what made it remarkable. It was the first time a man in Coldwater Flats had addressed her as a person whose knowledge had commercial value. Not as a widow, not as a curiosity, as someone who understood something he needed to understand. She told him she would come by the following Thursday. She did, and she looked at the hearth and she found the problem in 20 minutes. The firebox was too shallow relative to the throat opening, which created a pressure imbalance that reversed the draw in certain wind conditions and sent smoke back into the room. She told him what needed to be changed and how to change it and what materials were required, and she answered 3 follow-up questions with the same direct economy she brought to her transactions with Foss. He paid her. He thanked her without ceremony, which was the right kind of thanks, the kind that does not make the transaction awkward. She walked home. The people who came after Giddens came the same way he had come, not because she invited them and not because the community had formally revised its opinion of her, but because the information that she knew, things useful to people who lived on difficult land in a difficult climate, traveled the way useful information travels in small settlements, person to person, need to need. A woman whose well was yielding cloudy water, a man who wanted to build a root cellar and did not know how to manage the drainage, another man interested in the brick formula who had looked at Foss's hearth and done the arithmetic and concluded that producing his own building materials rather than hauling them 60 miles was worth investigating. She answered questions when people came with them. She showed the brick formula to the man who asked for it because knowledge that is hoarded against the possibility of competition is knowledge that has confused its own value. What she knew had come from the land itself, and she had paid for it in months of solitary work, and she could teach someone the formula without losing what she knew about how to read the ground it came from. She remained on her own terms throughout all of it. She did not go to the settlement socially. She did not try to fit into the community the way the community was shaped. She was still the woman on the bad claim 6 miles west of town, and she intended to remain that, because the bad claim 6 miles west of town was hers, and she understood it, and it had given her everything she had through the honest mechanism of showing her exactly what it was in exchange for the attention she had paid to it. The spring brought its incremental warmth and its mud and its tentative greening of the scrub grass, and Vera expanded the kiln and improved the water system and walked the boundary of the claim every morning with Flint, and stood at the eastern fence line sometimes in the early light, and looked back west across the full extent of the 300 acres, and tried to see it the way it had looked to people who had seen nothing in it. She could not. She had learned too much about it. She knew where the limestone ran. She knew where the water went after rain and where it came up again. She knew which sections of soil were deep enough to produce anything and which were too shallow over the rock shelves, and which areas were protected from the worst of the northwest wind by the geometry of the terrain. She knew which game trails were seasonal and which were permanent. She knew the hollow in the specific way of someone who has spent a winter inside it, understanding its temperature variations and its structural behaviors and its relationship to the weather above. She knew things about this particular piece of ground that no survey had captured and no assessment had reflected, and no subsequent owner, should there ever be one, would understand without years of the same paying attention. This knowledge was not something Ward could buy. It was not something Dowell Crane could take away by pressing a coin into her palm and riding east. It lived in her hands and her memory and the specific relationship between her attention and this specific ground. And it was, she understood now, the thing that had never been at risk from any of the pressures that had been brought to bear on her since October. They had tried to take the land. They had not understood that the land and what she knew about it were no longer separable. June arrived with its long light and its warmth that felt genuinely generous after the winter that had preceded it, and the scrub grass on the claim went green along the south-facing slopes, and the cottonwood root system, still massive overhead, put out small green shoots from the stumps, where secondary growth was establishing itself in the wreckage of the original tree. Vera noticed this and found it appropriate and did not make more of it than it was, which was simply a living thing doing what living things do when conditions allow. She was at the kiln on a Tuesday morning when Foss appeared at the eastern fence line, which was the first time he had come to the claim, rather than waiting for her to come to him. He was on foot, having walked the 6 miles in the morning, and he looked slightly less composed than he did behind his counter, but no less deliberate. She met him at the fence line. He said Ward had quietly sold the parcel immediately north of her claim to a homesteader family from Nebraska, which meant his immediate adjacency to her water source was being broken by a third-party presence that complicated any continued pressure on that particular issue. He said it in his ledger voice as information, not as news. She said she had heard something about that. He said he thought she should know that the conversation about her in the settlement had changed. He said it the way he said things, flatly, as a report on an observed condition. He said she was no longer discussed as a problem. She was discussed as a fact of the landscape. Vera looked at him for a moment. A fact of the landscape, she said. He said that was about the highest standing a person could achieve in this territory, in his experience, and he appeared to mean it without irony. She said she appreciated him walking out to tell her. He said he had also come because he wanted to ask whether she had considered the possibility of selling bricks to the settlement building project in a more formal arrangement. There was talk of a proper schoolhouse being constructed before winter, he said, and the committee that was discussing it had asked him quietly whether the material she was producing could be depended upon for a full building project rather than just hearths and foundations. She said she would need to know the timeline and the quantity. He said he would find that out and come back to her. They stood for a moment at the fence line in the morning light, the Wyoming spring wide and clear around them, and Foss looked at the hollow and the kiln and the stone wall around the water source and the extended snare lines visible along the nearest trail. And he looked at it the way a man looks at something that has turned out to be different from what it appeared, a kind of prolonged taking stock that had enough respect in it to be worth receiving. He said Samuel would have been glad to see this place. She heard the name and felt the familiar structural weight of it, the healed break in the bone. She looked out at the land for a moment. Then she said that Emmett would have liked the limestone formation especially. He would have spent a week mapping it, she said. He would have made her walk every outcropping twice. Foss made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was related to one. Then he nodded and turned back east toward the track and the 6 miles home, and she watched him go with Flint sitting beside her, and the morning light moved on the surface of the Wyoming high plains in the way it moves in late spring, low and gold and honest. She turned back to the kiln. The bricks for the current batch needed another 4 hours at temperature before she could begin cooling them down. She had improved the firing process to the point where she lost fewer than 1 brick in 20 to cracking or structural failure, which represented months of incremental adjustment, each failure recorded and analyzed and accounted for in the next attempt. She was not a natural brickmaker. She had not grown up around kilns or stonework or any of the practical crafts that the people who were good at this had learned early. What she had was the willingness to be wrong repeatedly and keep going, and it had turned out to be sufficient. She stoked the kiln and checked the draw and settled in to wait. Flint lay in the dust near the kiln entrance, stretched full length on his side in the manner of a dog that has decided the situation does not require vigilance. He was heavier than he had been in October. His coat improved his ribs, no longer visible. He was not a beautiful animal. He had never been a beautiful animal. He was the kind of animal that is what it needs to be for the conditions it actually lives in, which is a better thing to be than beautiful. She thought about Dowell Crane pressing that coin into her palm in October and telling her there was nothing here. She thought about the way he had not met her eyes when he said it, the way he had been looking at the horizon and the horses and anything that was not her face. She had understood at the time that his inability to look at her was not guilt. It was the specific discomfort of a person who has reduced another person to a problem that has been solved, and who finds that the solved problem is still standing there, looking at him, still a person, still requiring acknowledgement that he had decided in advance not to give. She did not feel anger at him now. She did not feel much about him at all. He had made the decision that made sense to a person with his particular understanding of value and possibility, and he had been wrong, and the wrongness of it was not something she needed him to acknowledge in order for it to be real. The land had acknowledged it. Every day for 8 months, the land had been demonstrating what was actually here, what had always been here, what would be here long after every opinion about it had been revised or forgotten. She thought about the morning she had first stood at the rim of the root hollow and felt the warmth rising from the dead wood and the insulated earth, and thought about what Emmett had said about dead wood holding heat. She thought about how close she had come to not noticing it, not from inattention, but from the simple fact that you do not know what you are looking for until you find it and recognize it, and recognition requires something in you that is already prepared to receive the thing you are about to see. Emmett had prepared her. Not deliberately, not as instruction for a situation he knew she would face, but incidentally in the way that people prepare each other for things, without knowing they are doing it through conversation and observation, and the accumulation of shared attention over years. She had carried what he knew about the ground the way you carry things you did not know you were carrying. Not in your hands, but in your understanding of what things mean when you encounter them. She missed him. She had never stopped missing him, and she had made no effort to stop, and she had no intention of making such an effort. Missing him was not a problem to be solved. It was part of the structure of her life as present and as much her own as her hands. But she had done this. She wanted to be clear with herself about that in the private way of private reckonings. She had done this. The knowledge that had come from Emmett was hers now, not because he had given it to her, but because she had used it, had tested it against reality in the most demanding conditions available, had expanded it through months of her own observation and error and adjustment until it was as much her own understanding as anyone's knowledge can be said to be their own. You do not own what you have merely been told. You own what you have made yourself out of what you were given. The kiln held its temperature through the afternoon. She checked it twice and found it doing what it was supposed to do, and each time she went back to the other work she had set out for the day, the snare line maintenance in the eastern section, and the reinforcement of the north wall of the chamber where she had found a small crack in the clay daub that needed addressing before the summer rains arrived. The sky to the west was going orange and deep purple when she finally stopped for the day, the light long and low over the high plains, catching the pale limestone outcropping at the western edge of the claim, and making it glow briefly before the shadow of the terrain overtook it. She stood at the entrance to the hollow for a moment before going in. 300 acres. Rock and scrub and the chalky ghosts of a limestone formation running underground through all of it, and the water that the formation carried toward the surface at the western end, and the warmth that the earth itself provided to anything willing to go below the surface. Frost line and the clay that made bricks, and the game trails that gave up their rabbits to wire and patience, and the sky above it all that delivered weather without apology and light without discrimination, and the kind of silence that is not absence but presence. the presence of a world that has been here longer than any opinion about it. They had said it was worthless. They had said this with the confidence of people who have learned to read value from the surface of things, which is the only kind of reading available to people who will not put their hands in the ground and stay long enough to understand what they are touching. There is no worthless land. There is only land that has not yet been understood. There is land that is difficult and land that is ungenerous and land that will make you work for everything it has and give you nothing without that work. But there is no land that has nothing in it if you are willing to look past what it appears to be and learn what it actually is. Vera Crane had stayed long enough to learn. She had stayed when it was cold and when it was hard and when the sensible voices, her own among them in the dark hours, had made the case for leaving. She had stayed when the ground fought her and when the community dismissed her, and when the pressure of a powerful man's interest had made the cost of staying real and immediate and not abstract. She had stayed because the ground did not lie and she had trusted that, and the ground had shown her everything it had. She went inside. She put wood on the coals and listened to the fire establish itself and felt the warmth of the stone walls returning what they had stored through the day, and Flint settled in his place near the fire pit. And outside the hollow the Wyoming night came down over 300 acres of ground that was not a joke any more, and had not been for some time and would not be again.